How many times have you felt like you're in control of your own life, making choices, setting goals, and deciding your future? Now, what if I told you that not all of these choices were truly yours? There's something invisible that's deciding for you every day, without you even realizing it. A backstage director that guides your actions, your words, and even your silences. You might not have noticed, but when you avoid an uncomfortable conversation, delay an important decision, or hold back your emotions, you're not just pushing the conflict under the rug. You're pushing a part of yourself as well, and the more you hide it, the bigger it gets, like a plant growing roots in the dark. Silent, but eventually, it breaks through the ground and becomes visible. Carl Jung called this the shadow, a concept we're going to explore together throughout this video. It's not an external force or something that comes from outside. It's what you yourself have chosen to hide. Emotions, thoughts, impulses, and memories that were so uncomfortable that you locked them away in a mental box. But the problem is, that box doesn't stay quiet. It presses, it overflows, and without you realizing it, it starts making decisions for you. So, what are you pretending not to see? The things you bury inside of you don't just disappear. They take root and grow back. Maybe they're in the opportunities you missed, the words you never said, or the choices you didn't have the courage to make. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to understand what this shadow is that influences your decisions, why it forms, and most importantly, how you can regain control of your own life. If you've ever felt like, no matter how hard you try, it's as if you're driving a car with the handbrake on, then this video is for you, because it's not what you face that haunts you. It's what you pretend doesn't exist. Imagine there's a dark room inside you, a place where everything you don't want to see about yourself is thrown and locked away. In this space, live your repressed anger, your insecurities, your desires you don't dare admit, and even your talents that you never developed. This is the place Carl Jung called the shadow. Contrary to what many people think, the shadow is not something bad by nature, but rather everything that has been rejected and hidden. Since childhood, we learn to hide parts of ourselves. When a child gets angry and screams, they're often told, "Don't do that, be polite." When they express themselves too freely, they might hear, "Behave yourself." These messages are like bricks building the walls of the shadow. Over time, the child realizes that, to be accepted, they need to hide certain parts of themselves. This process is inevitable, but at the same time, it creates an internal divide. What is shown to the world, the persona, and what is hidden, the shadow. Let's use a concrete image to illustrate this. Imagine a dark box in the corner of a room. Every time you feel an uncomfortable emotion and decide to let it go, you're throwing that emotion into the box. When you have a thought you consider ugly or wrong, you push it into the box. At first, it seems like a quick and practical solution. But what happens when that box gets full? Yes, it overflows. The things you hid start showing up in unexpected ways. An outburst of anger during a discussion, a mental block when making important decisions, or a general sense of dissatisfaction with life. It's no wonder that so many people feel stuck in certain areas of their lives. This block isn't always external. Often, it's the shadow itself influencing our choices. A clear example of this is João. He's been working at the same company for years and has never asked for a raise, even though he knows he deserves one. Every time he thinks about talking to his boss, he hears an inner voice saying, "Better not." What if he thinks you're greedy? That voice isn't just rationality. It's the fear that's been pushed into the shadow. And until João faces that fear, the shadow will keep making decisions for him. Another more common example is in difficult conversations. How many times have you delayed talking to someone about an important problem, thinking it would avoid conflict, and in the end, what happened? The problem grew, and the conversation became unavoidable. This happens because the things you avoid confronting don't disappear. They just accumulate. That's exactly what the shadow does. It's the space where you store what you don't want to deal with until there's no more room to run. But here's an important truth. The shadow isn't the villain of your story. In fact, it's an essential part of who you are. Jung used to say, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This means that freedom doesn't come from getting rid of the shadow, but from getting to know it, because as long as you don't recognize what's hidden, it will keep making decisions for you. To close, here's a reflection for you. What parts of yourself are locked in that dark box? What fears, feelings, or desires have you been avoiding? Asking yourself this question is the first step toward regaining control of your own decisions. Now that you understand what the shadow is, it's time to recognize how it shows up in your daily life. The shadow doesn't always reveal itself in obvious ways. It operates subtly but powerfully, influencing your decisions, relationships, and even how you see yourself. Let's look at some examples. Think about the fear of failure. How many times have you declined a challenge or an opportunity because you were afraid you wouldn't be good enough? When this happens, it's not just a matter of caution. Most of the time, it's the shadow at work. The fear of not meeting expectations, which may have been formed in childhood due to excessive demands, was pushed inside, but it didn't disappear. So when an opportunity for a new job, a bold project, or even public speaking comes along, the shadow steps in saying, "Better not. You might fail and be criticized." Another classic example is in difficult conversations. We've all postponed an important conversation in order to keep the peace, whether it's with a friend, a boss, or a romantic partner. The inner dialogue usually sounds like, "Now's not the right time," or, "If I bring it up, I'll just create a mess." It seems like a rational decision, but in reality, it's the fear of conflict, which may have been repressed since childhood, taking control. In the end, the problem gets bigger. What started as a small annoyance turns into a bigger disagreement. And once again, the shadow was in charge. The shadow also acts unexpectedly in romantic relationships. Imagine someone who always tries not to seem too demanding in their relationship. They give in on small matters, don't express their desires, and often accept things they don't like just to avoid arguments. This behavior, which might seem like maturity or patience, is often the shadow in control. Over time, what happens? The accumulation of frustrations builds up. Suddenly, an argument erupts, out of nowhere, and the person doesn't even understand why they're so upset. But it wasn't out of nowhere. It was the result of everything that had been repressed. In the professional field, the shadow's influence is just as strong. Imagine a professional who has brilliant ideas during meetings, but never shares them. They think, "What if it's not a good idea? What if people judge me?" This doubt keeps them silent. In the end, other colleagues present similar ideas and get recognized. For them, it feels like they're invisible, like, "I'm never appreciated." But the truth is, they were the ones who hid themselves. The fear of being exposed, stored in the shadow, was what made the decision for them. But the shadow doesn't only show up in meetings. It often appears in our dreams and personal projects, holding back our progress. Let's talk about Carlos. He dreams of starting his own business, but never takes the first step. Every time he thinks about it, the perfect excuses pop up. "Now isn't the right time. I need to study more before I try. I'll do it later." At first, this seems like caution and even common sense. But, over time, Carlos realizes that he never actually feels ready to begin. And why does this happen? Because his shadow is in control. Carlos doesn't realize that this voice of caution isn't coming from reason, but from an old memory, perhaps from a time when he was criticized for not doing things perfectly. Today, he still tries to avoid making mistakes at any cost. By doing this, he protects himself from potential failure, but at the same time, he prevents his own growth. In the end, he stays stuck in an uncomfortable comfort zone, all because his shadow is making the decisions for him. These examples show how the shadow operates silently and invisibly. How many opportunities have you missed because you were afraid of failure? How many conversations have you postponed because you feared discomfort? And how many times have you stayed silent, even when you knew you had something important to say? All of these situations have one thing in common: the shadow working behind the scenes. Maybe it's time to bring to light what's been hidden. Take a look at where you've been holding back, where you've been letting fear make decisions for you. Ignoring what's in your shadow might seem like an effective short-term strategy, but the long-term cost is high when you don't face what's hidden. It's like driving a car with the handbrake on. You might put in more effort, but you don't get anywhere. Or worse, you end up damaging the car. And that's exactly how it is in life. One of the first signs that the shadow is taking control is the feeling of stagnation, relationships that seem to go nowhere, opportunities that pass you by, and goals that never leave the paper. This isn't the result of bad luck or lack of ability, but often the shadow making decisions for you. Imagine someone who avoids asking for feedback at work because they're afraid of criticism. They might avoid discomfort in the short term, but over time, their career stalls without feedback. They don't know where to improve, and consequently they don't grow. Another effect of the shadow is emotional exhaustion. Every time you swallow an emotion, it doesn't disappear. What was repressed stays inside, and at some point it overflows. This can manifest as outbursts of anger, anxiety attacks, or even physical symptoms like headaches and muscle tension. It's the body's way of trying to deal with what was ignored. You've probably experienced something like this. After a day full of small frustrations, one final situation triggers a disproportionate reaction. It wasn't that single event. It was the accumulation of everything that had been pushed into the shadow. In relationships, the cost of living without acknowledging the shadow is even more apparent. Imagine someone who never expresses their needs for fear of being seen as difficult. They give in to everything. Accept what the other person wants, and try to avoid any conflict. At first, this may seem like a strategy to maintain peace, but what happens next? Frustration, resentment, and often, breakups. Because no one can pretend that everything is okay forever. The person who never says, "I don't want this," eventually explodes. And the other person doesn't understand why. Because from their perspective, everything always seemed fine. The shadow also affects life choices. How many times have you given up on an opportunity because you didn't feel ready? That feeling of inadequacy, which often shows up as, "it's better to wait a little longer," is actually the shadow at work. Maybe, at some point in your life, you were told that you weren't good enough, and to avoid the pain of failure, you decided to avoid risky situations. The problem is, by avoiding risk, you also avoid growth. The ultimate cost of ignoring the shadow is the loss of autonomy. When you don't face your repressed parts, you're not in conscious control of your decisions. Instead, your choices are driven by fear, shame, and guilt that were hidden in the shadow. It's as if you're being guided by an invisible hand, and it's not yours. But here's the good news. This can be reversed. By looking at what was repressed, you regain control. The light of awareness dispels the darkness, and what once seemed like a monster reveals itself to be just a part of you that needs attention and care. So, pay attention to what you're avoiding. Notice the unsaid no's, the postponed conversations, and the opportunities you keep leaving for later. All of these could be signs that your shadow is taking the wheel. And remember, as long as you don't face what you've hidden, it will continue making decisions for you. If, up until now, you've realized that the shadow plays an invisible role in your choices, now is the time to understand how to regain control. It's not about eliminating the shadow, but about bringing to light what was once unconscious. When you recognize what's hidden, it loses the power to make decisions for you. The first tool for doing this is to recognize your escapes. What are the conversations you keep putting off? Which situations do you prefer to avoid? Look at your daily routine and identify these moments. It might be the meeting you avoid, the "I'll deal with that later" excuse you keep repeating, or that phone call you never make. Every time you postpone something, you're feeding the shadow. You don't have to resolve everything at once. The key here is to notice where the escape is happening. The second step is to name your emotions. Often, what has been repressed is just an emotion that was never given a name. Anger, fear, sadness, shame. When you feel these emotions, the natural tendency is to push them away. But when you observe them and give them a name, they lose their mystery. Try this. The next time you feel a strong emotion, stop for a moment and ask yourself, what emotion am I feeling right now? Naming it is the first step to bringing it out of the shadow. Another powerful tool is to face one mini shadow per day. This means taking one small action that you would normally avoid. It doesn't have to be something grand. It could be starting that conversation you've been putting off, expressing an opinion in a meeting, or saying no to a request you would normally accept out of pressure. Small actions lead to big changes. Each time you face a mini shadow, you build confidence to tackle bigger challenges. Now, let's move on to a practical exercise. Think of a situation you've been avoiding. It could be a decision you need to make, a conversation you've been dodging, or even a simple task you've been procrastinating on. Identify what's behind this avoidance. Is it fear of making a mistake? Is it the discomfort of confrontation? Now that you have clarity, write down on a piece of paper what you're going to do today to face this situation. One small step is enough. And if you'd like, share it in the comments. The power of putting it out into the world is greater than you think. This is where everything comes together. Everything we've explored about the shadow, from its origin to its manifestations in everyday life, leads to one essential question: who's really in control of your choices? If you've made it this far, you're no longer the same person who started this journey. You now understand that what you hide doesn't disappear. The shadow is not the villain. It's a call to consciousness. The more you ignore it, the more it finds ways to appear in postponed choices, unspoken conversations, and fears that hold you back. The key point here is responsibility. Because as long as you allow the hidden parts of yourself to make decisions for you, your life will be a reactive response to those unconscious impulses. But when you bring those parts into the light, you reclaim your power to choose. Jung reminds us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's what's at stake here. Look at yourself with courage. It's not about defeating the shadow, but integrating it. If there's one phrase that can close this reflection, it's this: it's not what you face that haunts you. It's what you pretend doesn't exist. Everything that is repressed comes back, and you have the opportunity to decide if you will continue pretending not to see it, or if you will face what has always been there. Now, I want you to pause and reflect for a moment. How many times have you told yourself, "I'll do it later. I need more time. I'm not ready yet"? Maybe it was about starting a course, launching a personal project, or accepting a bigger challenge at work. Was it really you making that decision? Or was it your shadow acting on your behalf? Write it in the comments. What project or dream have you been putting off because you believe you're not ready yet? I'd love to read about it and, who knows, maybe even have a chat with you. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.